Welcome to Pop-Up Camper Pro. I'm your host Eric Smith, and today we're going to cover all the different types of Coleman and Fleetwood lift systems. In this video, we're going to cover the manual crank assemblies on Coleman and Fleetwood pop-up campers. This is to help you identify which lift system you might have to assist you if you need to work on it, repair it, lubricate it, whatever you got to do. You should be able to use this video to determine that's the exact system that I have. There are four main components to a Coleman and Fleetwood lift system: the crank assembly, whiffle tree, the cables, and the lift arms. With just the last three of those, you can raise a camper's roof. Without the first one, a crank assembly, you need a way to lock it in place while it's raising and raised. The earliest units, they used catches, commonly at the whiffle tree. Let's start with those. The whiffle tree safety patch. The whiffle tree safety catch can be pins, brackets, latches, and even the crank handle in conjunction with a pin to suspend the roof. Here are some examples and the models that they're most commonly found on. For our first example, we have the lift lock system. For the lift lock, it's a squared box that pulls and pushes over a pin. So this bracket here pulls out to unlock. It releases a square bracket off of the pin inside that you use to raise the roof. Pushing it back in with the pin at a 45-degree angle locks the pin back inside the box and suspends the roof. Secondly, we have the safety latch. So this latch is bolted next to the drive shaft, and when the roof is up, you swing it over onto the second pin to suspend the roof. Other units use brackets to fall onto the pin to hold the roof. On a few Destiny series units in the early 90s, we have a spring pin that would pop out and grab hold of the crank handle. Crank handle would stay in the bumper, and that's what would hold the roof. These units can be raised right at the whiffle tree or with a chain drive system. When a chain drive system is used, a 12-tooth sprocket in the upper system drives a 12-tooth lower gear. These always set at a 45-degree angle. On 1968 to 1988 Americana series units and all 1993 Pioneer units, we find ratchet brackets at the lower crank extensions. The ratchet bracket is the earliest version of a lift lock system. A spring cam presses against this gear and it locks the system in place when you stop raising the roof. These always use the butterfly key. The butterfly key raises and lowers this cam. Let's take a more in-depth look of the lift system that we just saw in that bird's eye view. The next graphic is going to show you from the end of the whiffle tree extension to the pulley routing bracket. This setup is most commonly found on units from the start of production till the early 1990s. We have a pin catch up here for our additional safety catch, 12-tooth lower drive gear, carrier bearing, extension shaft, coupler. This is the end of the whiffle tree. We have a one-hole thrust nut here. This is the application for this assembly, since this just pins directly to the whiffle tree, and that supports the 3000 series thrust bearing. We have a bearing spacer plate. This is a reinforcement plate that's used on some units. We have the whiffle tree and the pulley separator bracket. In all 1989 Americana series units, the ratchet bracket system moves to an upper crank position location. This continues until 1993. It features the ratchet bracket located here and it is driving a 24-tooth gear. Here's an example of this system. In 1993, all 4 season series pop-up campers used the same upper crank and ratchet bracket configuration, but with a slightly different modification. The stance is shorter here. It has a shorter mounting bracket for the ratchet bracket inside of it, and the chain drive gear is 18-tooth. From 1986 to 1991, all Plantation series pop-ups used the ratchet bracket system located in an upper crank location. We find it installed in this larger standoff bracket again at a 45-degree angle, and it's installed to the right rear location on these pop-ups. Now, these crank assemblies we just covered, these ratchet systems, can be replaced by one of today's compression clutch weld-on solutions. So to choose the correct one, you just simply want to measure the distance from the end of the shaft to the mounting plate. We can see that this system would be best serviced with this 5111 replacement system. This one here, the 4141 would work. Before we move on to the next segment, I'd like to take a moment to enjoy some little artist work they wanted to draw on the chalkboard with me. Hashtag encourage the arts. In 1994, we see the introduction of the ratchet clutch crank systems. The ratchet clutch system takes over all the previous designs and was built to easily replace all the previous versions. Let's take an in-depth look at the first direct drive system. From 1994 to 1998, all Destiny series pop-up campers used the 3000 series direct drive crank assembly. They're mounted at the rear of the camper, bumper level, directly at the center. These crank assemblies, they're pinned directly to the whiffle tree, and the thrust bearing is incorporated into the crank assembly. For the 3000 series crank assemblies, the orders of the components are drive hub extension tube, crank housing, crank bushing, beveled washer, ratchet pawl gear, ratchet pawl system, clutch, drive shaft, bearing housing, 2-hole thrust nut. This is the application for the 2-hole thrust nut, since one pins to the drive shaft and the other side pins to the whiffle tree, which would be back here. 3000 series bearing. This is a bearing that's directional. The open face of this bearing sits against the base of the thrust nut, and we have the bearing spacer plate. In 1994, all the upper crank assemblies were replaced with the compression clutch release systems as well. Until 1995, all the Pioneer series units and 2 of the 4 season units used these systems with the crank assembly set at a 45-degree angle. The 2 4-season models are the Cape Cod and the Utah. In 1996, we start to see the 45-degree offset angle phased out, and we go to a vertical stance for upper crank chain-driven systems. These systems can have different length drive hub extension tubes. Picking the correct version, again, is as easy as making sure that the end of your tube is going to exit past the body panel a little bit. If you've stuck with me this far, way to go. We've only got 2 more systems to cover. In 1999, we see the introduction of the 6311 direct drive crank assembly. This unit replaces all the center-mounted direct drive systems, but it's not backwards compatible to the previous 3000 versions. If you have a 3000 series direct drive system, replace with that assembly. And here's an interesting note. This direct drive system is a modification of the 3000 series. So what changed is we've lost the 2-hole thrust nut in the 3000 series bearing here, and they've added a spacer, a plastic bearing housing cup inside this bracket, 6311 thrust bearing, and a 2-hole coupler bushing. In 2001 and 2002, all Grand Tour models 12-foot box sized, used a left-hand chain drive assembly. This crank assembly is mounted bumper level and sits off to the left. It drives a 12-tooth gear to a thrust nut and a 3000 series bearing. And that covers all the manual crank assemblies. Now this covers, I shouldn't say all of them, it covers most of them. There are a few variations from ratios over the years. Some of the 4 season units for a couple of years used an 18-tooth upper gear and so on and so forth. But for the most part, that's it. So that should help you if you wondering what crank assembly does my camper have. You also have lots of other resources available too to figure this out. Of course, me, our business, the parts book available for you free online, and the online community. You guys tend to be a bigger expert than I ever hoped to be. Collectively, you all know a lot more, just from having your campers and working on them and experiencing them and all the other little tips and tricks that you've shared with me. So thanks to everything that you guys do. You've been, my inspiration and my biggest instructor. So thank you very much for watching, folks. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. If you like the video, give it a big thumbs up. Mash the notification bell to be alerted when new content is available. I will see you at the campground.